For decades, Hollywood has insisted that every visual and sonic effect used in a film must be safe, regulated, and predictable. But buried beneath the industry's polished surface is a different history, one shaped by experimental techniques that pushed far beyond entertainment. Long before CGI took over the modern landscape, directors worked with analog tools, unstable sound frequencies, and optical machinery capable of producing sensations no audience had ever experienced and perhaps was never meant to. Some of these techniques were designed to manipulate tension. Others could interfere with depth perception, heartbeat rhythm, or even the viewer's sense of balance. They weren't illegal, at least not officially, but they hovered in a gray zone between art and human experimentation. Over time, a pattern emerged. A film would debut, strange reports from viewers would follow, controversy would rise, and the technique would quietly disappear from Hollywood's toolbox, never mentioned again. No memos, no formal bans, just silence. The reasons behind these disappearances are as fractured as the effects themselves. Some triggered psychological responses stronger than test audiences could tolerate. Others generated physical symptoms, dizziness, nausea, panic that theater owners refused to risk repeating. A few became the subject of rumors, meetings behind closed doors, pressure from studios, and technology consultants warning that the effects reached deeper into human cognition than anyone realized. Today, only fragments of that lost era remain. A handful of films still carry the fingerprints of these unauthorized techniques, moments where image and sound behave strangely, as if the movie itself is reaching outward. These aren't accidents. They are remnants of methods that Hollywood once explored and then abandoned without explanation. In this episode, we open the vault on 15 sci-fi films that dared to cross that threshold. Some used sound frequencies that bypass conscious hearing. Others deployed flicker patterns or subliminal cuts that played tricks on the brain. All of them pushed the boundary between cinema and psychological engineering. And all of them left a question Hollywood never answered. Why were these techniques allowed once, and why can no one use them again? 1. The Last Starfighter, 1984. The Last Starfighter is celebrated for pioneering early CGI, but hidden beneath its groundbreaking visuals was a motion processing glitch that studios vowed never to repeat. The film's digital render engine, still in its infancy, produced motion streak artifacts, subtle frame distortions that appeared when objects moved faster than the system could accurately sample. Instead of blending smoothly, shapes elongated or smeared across the screen for fractions of a second, creating a resonance effect that unsettled the visual cortex. Audiences in 1984 had no vocabulary for what they were experiencing. Some described a warping snap in fast scenes, others felt a mild queasiness when ships shifted direction abruptly. Engineers analyzing viewer complaints discovered that the artifacts landed within a perceptual danger zone, motion that appeared fluid at one moment and abruptly non-linear the next. This mismatch disrupted the brain's ability to predict spatial continuity, a known trigger for motion-induced discomfort. Universal Studios grew concerned when several screenings reported clusters of headaches and eye strain, particularly among viewers seated close to the screen. The emerging CGI pipeline was powerful but unstable, and the industry realized it had unintentionally crossed into neurological territory. Internal technical bulletins from the era urged effects teams to avoid rendering models at velocities that exceeded sampling thresholds, calling such imagery perceptually unsafe. The artifact never became a scandal, but its influence was profound. CGI developers redesigned interpolation algorithms, stabilizing motion at the cost of abandoning the high-speed effects seen in The Last Starfighter. Hollywood effectively banned motion streak artifacts not through regulation, but through technological avoidance. Today, modern remasters have corrected the visual instability, meaning contemporary audiences rarely encounter the film's original experimental edge. Yet, The Last Starfighter remains a rare glimpse into a transitional era when digital imagery brushed against the limits of human perception and revealed how easily innovation could slip into sensory overload. 2. Sunshine, 2007. Danny Boyle's Sunshine pushed the boundaries of cinematic light, and in doing so, it revived, then extinguished a technique Hollywood once used sparingly: high-intensity overexposure pulses designed to mimic overwhelming solar radiation. Boyle's vision required audiences to feel the sun as a psychological force, not simply a visual one. To achieve this, the effects team introduced rhythmic exposure bursts in scenes involving direct contact with the stellar phenomenon. These pulses hit the retina with abrupt luminosity shifts, creating a sensation of heat and impending collapse. Early screenings produced unexpected physiological responses. Viewers squinted, looked away instinctively, or reported momentary flashes of vertigo. Some described the experience as being pushed backward, a reaction associated with abrupt luminance spikes. Medical consultants noted that the exposure pulses approached thresholds known to impair visual adaptation, particularly when paired with intense color saturation. While not dangerous, the technique carried a risk of overwhelming viewers' comfort levels. Fox Searchlight grew concerned after several theaters reported complaints of headaches and visual fatigue. Executives feared the film's pulsating brightness might be interpreted as a safety hazard, especially in light of increased public awareness of photosensitive sensitivity. As a result, certain sequences were softened, and internal guidelines advised against aggressive overexposure rhythms in future productions. Sunshine's remaining pulses still achieve their intended effect. The sun feels oppressive, alive, almost predatory, but Hollywood stepped back from the technique after witnessing audience reactions. The industry concluded that controlled overexposure could too easily cross into perceptual overstimulation. In the years since, no major sci-fi film has attempted exposure pulsing at sunshine's intensity. The technique was simply too powerful, too unpredictable, and too physically demanding on viewers. Boyle's film stands as both a triumph of sensory design and a boundary Hollywood quietly agreed not to cross again. Donnie Darko, 2001. Donnie Darko is known for its haunting atmosphere and time loop narrative, but few viewers realize that the film originally incorporated a subtle visual technique later discouraged across Hollywood: low-frequency flicker overlays designed to evoke temporal instability. Director Richard Kelly experimented with intermittent brightness modulation micro-pulses layered into select scenes, particularly those involving frank or disturbances in the timeline. These pulses were not traditional strobes. They were slow, almost imperceptible fluctuations that created a subconscious sense of unease, mimicking the feeling of time warping. During early screenings, audiences reported unusual reactions. Some described a vague nausea that surfaced only during supernatural sequences. Others felt an undefinable tension, as if something in the image rhythm was out of sync with reality. Editors identified the cause. The flicker overlays occasionally struck frequencies that interfered with viewers' visual processing comfort zone. While not intense enough to cause medical concern, the effect was psychologically abrasive, too effective at making the world of Donnie Darko feel unstable. Studio executives debated whether the technique crossed a neurological line. Ultimately, the flicker layers were reduced for the theatrical release, though traces remain visible in several shots. Internal notes from the period caution against using brightness modulation as a tool for emotional manipulation, arguing that subtle, ambient flicker could affect viewers without their awareness. This pushed the effect into what Hollywood considered an ethically ambiguous space. As digital mastering evolved, studios quietly removed similar modulation techniques from their toolbox, citing unpredictable audience responses. Donnie Darko's remaining flicker signatures function as spectral residues, an artifact of a sensory technique mainstream cinema chose not to revisit. The result is a film whose psychological power exceeds what appears on screen. Its visual rhythm touches the viewer's subconscious, demonstrating how even gentle flicker can destabilize perception. Donnie Darko remains a cult classic not only for its story, but for a technique Hollywood deemed too quietly disruptive. 4. The Matrix, 1999. The Matrix revolutionized action cinema through bullet-time photography, but early versions of its signature effect involved a visual component that was later scrapped for safety reasons. During initial tests, the Wachowskis and their effects team used synchronized strobe emitters around the bullet-time rig to mark precise camera positions for multi-angle interpolation. These strobes pulsed rapidly as actors moved through the scene, producing unintended microflashes that bled into test footage. When projected, the flicker created a pulsating halo effect around moving objects, hypnotic, disorienting, and far more intense than the clean bullet time sequences audiences eventually saw. Test viewers reported a range of adverse reactions, from eye strain to dizziness, and one viewer described the sensation as falling sideways inside my own vision. Engineers recognized the problem immediately. The rogue flicker overlapped with frequencies known to disturb the brain's motion processing pathways. Though the effect looked futuristic, it bordered on neurologically destabilizing. Warner Brothers halted use of the strobe-based calibration system and ordered the team to redesign the rig to avoid any rhythmic pulses. The incident was never widely publicized, but internal documents confirm that studios thereafter issued informal guidelines discouraging strobe-assisted capture for high-motion scenes. The Wachowskis shifted entirely to stable LED markers and refined optical tracking tools, ensuring the final film avoided the dangerous perception warping artifacts seen in early tests. While The Matrix is now synonymous with smooth, elegant motion control, its first attempts produced visual distortions Hollywood quietly labeled non-compliant. These early experiments showed how easily groundbreaking innovation could drift into neurological risk. The final film remains iconic, but it's a polished version of a technique that once pushed directly into unsafe perceptual territory. 5. Existence Z, 1999. David Cronenberg's Existence Z is remembered for its organic biotechnology and reality-bending narrative, but the film's most unsettling effect came from a subtle manipulation of motion perception. Cronenberg and his team experimented with organic distortion, a technique involving variable frame interpolation and micro-warping of edges within the shot. This created movements that felt natural at first glance, but grew increasingly uncanny gestures that lingered a fraction too long or shifted with a curvature that defied physical consistency. The effect wasn't overt, and that was precisely its strength. During early screenings, several viewers reported difficulty determining whether certain scenes were real or digitally altered, even though most of the film was shot practically. Others described a mild dissociative sensation, as if the boundaries between objects and backgrounds were softening. Neurologists later noted that inconsistent peripheral motion can disrupt spatial anchoring, triggering subconscious unease. Though the distortions were subtle, they pushed against Hollywood's comfort zone. Studio technicians warned that the method risked unintended physiological responses similar to motion sickness triggers, especially when applied intermittently. As digital editing matured, some engineers proposed refining the technique, but internal assessments concluded it was psychologically unstable, meaning it could not be predicted or standardized across different screen sizes or projection systems. By the mid-2000s, organic distortion effectively disappeared from mainstream sci-fi. Digital pipelines shifted toward hyperstability, leaving Existence Z as a rare artifact from an era willing to blur visual boundaries in ways that tampered with perception. Cronenberg dismantled the border between the virtual and the physical so effectively that Hollywood quietly placed the technique on its list of do not revisit tools. 6. Event Horizon 1997. Event Horizon is infamous for its nightmarish imagery, but the most controversial aspect of its production wasn't what audiences clearly saw, it was what they weren't supposed to. Paul W.S. Anderson incorporated subliminal horror frames into the film's more chaotic sequences, single-frame insertions of distorted bodies, violent tableau, and heavily processed sound cues designed to register only on the subconscious. These fleeting images, lasting 1/24 of a second, bypassed conscious recognition while still activating emotional and physiological responses associated with panic stimuli. Test screenings revealed just how potent the technique was. Audience members reported sudden spikes of anxiety, a sense of dread without identifiable cause, and moments of derealization symptoms typically associated with subliminal priming. Studio executives were disturbed by the reactions, not because the imagery was inappropriate, but because viewers seemed to be reacting to things they couldn't fully recall seeing. Paramount forced Anderson to cut down several of the most intense insertions, but even the reduced version retained traces of subliminal content. Internal correspondence from the era shows executives warning that subliminal frames posed a non-quantifiable liability risk, especially if viewers experienced psychological distress. Hollywood quietly discouraged the practice afterward, and editors were advised never to use subliminal inserts without explicit approval. The fear wasn't censorship, it was unpredictability. Subliminal horror didn't trigger complaints because audiences didn't consciously perceive the cause of their discomfort, and that made studios uneasy. Event Horizon's final cut still contains enough of these micro-insertions to unsettle attentive viewers, but the original sequences have achieved near-mythical status. The technique itself, though not illegal, effectively vanished from mainstream sci-fi. It was simply too effective, too manipulative, and too difficult to regulate. 7. Tetsuo, the Iron Man, 1989. Tetsuo, the Iron Man is a frenetic fusion of body horror and cyberpunk, but its true disruption came from a camera technique that pushed audiences into sensory overload. Director Shinya Tsukamoto used an aggressive combination of stop-motion bursts, jittery handheld shots, and deliberately unstable exposure rhythms to create the sensation of metal and flesh violently merging. Rather than smooth motion, Tetsuo's world spasms frames lurch forward, reverse, skip, or collide, forming an erratic visual pulse that feels more like a biological spasm than a cinematic sequence. This wasn't merely stylistic chaos. It was a controlled assault on perceptual stability. Early viewers described symptoms ranging from nausea and dizziness to a kind of dissociative detachment, as if the film were vibrating at a frequency incompatible with normal sight. Critics at festival screenings called the film physically exhausting, and several attendees reportedly stepped out mid-screening to recover from the intensity. The issue wasn't the imagery itself, it was the rhythmic inconsistency Tsukamoto engineered. The camera oscillations mimicked high-frequency motion patterns studied in experimental psychology, patterns known to disrupt the brain's ability to track spatial continuity. Some sequences incorporated micro-flicker lighting produced by malfunctioning industrial lamps, intentionally included for their unnerving pulse. Combined, these elements created a sensory landscape Hollywood deemed too unpredictable. By the early 1990 seconds, studios referencing Tetsuo in internal meetings described it as an example of non-compliant motion stress. Without issuing bans, the industry shifted away from techniques involving unstable frame cadence or violent stop-motion alternation, marking the film as a boundary that mainstream cinematography chose not to cross again. Tetsuo remains a cult phenomenon, but its visual methodology, part cinema, part psychological experiment, became a ghost in Hollywood's technical archives. Its impact lingers not through imitation, but through avoidance. It demonstrated how camera movement could bypass the intellect and strike directly at the nervous system, something the industry had no desire to replicate. Akira 59 date, 1 date. Akira is widely regarded as a cyberpunk masterpiece, but few viewers realize that one of its most famous techniques, rapid-fire strobe bursts during psychic attack scenes, was controversial enough to prompt quiet restrictions across several distribution channels. The film employed ultra-short alternating light frames, sometimes only a single frame apart, to evoke the violent psychic resonance of Tetsuo's transformations. While visually stunning, these patterns directly overlapped with known triggers of sensory overload. When Akira premiered, reports emerged of viewers experiencing nausea, eye strain, and momentary disorientation. Some screenings documented clusters of patrons rubbing their eyes or looking away during the highest intensity sequences. Though these reactions were nowhere near the large-scale incidents later associated with certain animated broadcasts, they were significant enough to draw internal concern within Japanese and international distributors. Analysts noted that the strobe cycles occasionally dipped into frequencies known to disrupt neural synchronization, particularly in younger viewers. Rather than issue formal warnings, several distributors simply advised projectionists to slightly dim brightness levels or adjust frame cadence, unofficial interventions intended to reduce the strobe's intensity without altering the film itself. Hollywood studios took note. By the early 1990 seconds, many animation and visual effects departments quietly abandoned similar rapid strobe frame cycles, citing Akira as a key reference when discussing viewer safety. What sets Akira apart is how intentional the effect was. The stuttered bursts mirrored the chaotic expansion of psychic force, translating metaphysical concepts into aggressive optical language. The result was a technique too effective for its own good, a visual rhythm capable of overwhelming the brain's pattern recognition system. Today, Akira's influence on style and world-building remains immense, but its most extreme optical techniques have been largely retired. The film stands as evidence of how animation can reach the edge of neurological tolerance and why studios tread more carefully now. 9 Tron, 1982. Tron is often celebrated as a pioneering digital film, but buried beneath its neon landscapes was a visual experiment that Hollywood quickly abandoned after witnessing its physiological impact on audiences. While the movie's iconic aesthetic appears clean and geometric, several sequences relied on analog light cycling techniques that produced micro-flicker patterns invisible to casual viewers, yet potent enough to disrupt visual equilibrium. These pulses occurred when traditional animation, backlit plates, and early computer-generated elements overlapped, creating unintended rhythmic flashes within the composite image. During test screenings, some viewers reported dizziness, headaches, or a sense of floating instability. Others described difficulty focusing, as if the image were oscillating even when static. Disney technicians discovered that the analog compositing process had produced flicker frequencies in the 12-18 Hz range, precisely the band known to interfere with the brain's motion perception circuits. Though the visual effect was mild, its consequences were not. Theater managers documented scattered walkouts and complaints of nausea. Disney publicly attributed these reactions to Tron's unconventional style, but internal memos urged teams to avoid repeating the technique. Engineers warned that such flicker interactions could not be reliably controlled and might create unpredictable neurological effects. By the mid-1980 seconds, studios quietly phased out similar hybrid analog-digital methods, replacing them with safer, fully digital pipelines. What makes Tron's case unique is that the flicker was not entirely deliberate. It emerged from technological limitations, an accidental discovery of a visual stimulus the human brain reacts to strongly. The industry interpreted this as a potential hazard, especially as photosensitivity awareness increased. Though Tron remains a cult favorite, its unintended experiment in perceptual stress became a cautionary tale. Modern remasters have corrected most of the instability, meaning contemporary audiences never experienced the film as 1,982 viewers did. But those early reactions left a permanent mark. Hollywood realized that even small technical anomalies could reach deeper into the mind than anticipated. 10. Altered States, 1,980. Altered States is often celebrated for its avant-garde imagery, but few remember that the film employed one of the most controversial flicker-based techniques ever allowed in a major studio release. Director Ken Russell incorporated rapid, high-contrast visual bursts into the film's hallucination sequences patterns, known as hallucinatory flicker, similar to those used in early sensory deprivation experiments. These bursts fluctuated between 6 and 20 flashes per second, a range that can alter visual processing and, in some individuals, trigger trance-like states. During early screenings, several viewers experienced dizziness and nausea, while others reported moments of perceptual distortion that lingered after the film ended. Medical consultants warned that the flicker frequencies overlapped with ranges known to affect neural synchronization. Although the scenes were brief, their intensity left a lasting impression, prompting some theaters to post unofficial warnings before showings. Hollywood began reassessing flicker-induced effects after complaints emerged. Insurance underwriters expressed concerns about liability if a viewer suffered a severe reaction, especially after research surfaced linking similar visual patterns to disorientation or, in rare cases, seizure risk. The controversy was amplified by the film's association with psychological experimentation, reinforcing the perception that Altered States was treading dangerously close to real neurological manipulation. Studio executives subsequently adopted an unwritten rule: avoid high-intensity flicker sequences unless absolutely necessary, and always keep them under tightly controlled conditions. As a result, the aggressive flicker montages seen in Altered States virtually disappeared from mainstream sci-fi. Despite this, the film endures as a bold exploration of consciousness, blurring the line between cinematic technique and mind-altering stimulus. Its visual experiments opened a door Hollywood quickly closed, leaving Altered States as one of the last major films to test how far flicker could push the human brain. Elf Eraserhead, 1977. David Lynch's Eraserhead holds a legendary place in experimental cinema, but one of its lesser-known legacies is the industry's retreat from a sound technique that proved far more potent than expected. Lynch layered the entire film with a dense, continuous bed of low-frequency industrial noise, a blend of mechanical hums, electrical drones, and modulated rumbling that extended far below the comfortable auditory range. Unlike typical soundtracks, these textures were not tied to on-screen events. Instead, they functioned as atmospheric pressure, subtly manipulating the audience's nervous system over the film's full duration. Many viewers reported unusual physical responses, tightening in the chest, a sense of internal vibration, or the uncanny feeling that the theater itself was breathing. Such sensations aligned with known effects of sustained low-frequency exposure, especially when paired with emotionally charged imagery. Theater managers noted that Eraserhead produced an abnormally high rate of walkouts, with some patrons citing nausea or panic that seemed to arise without a clear trigger. Hollywood had no formal guidelines for this kind of sound design, but Eraserhead triggered discussions among studio sound departments. Some engineers argued the film's audio bed functioned more like psychological conditioning than traditional mixing. Others warned that excessively low frequencies, especially when combined with monotonic industrial resonance, could induce anxiety spikes and dissociation in sensitive viewers. Although Lynch himself downplayed any intent to manipulate physiology, later interviews revealed his interest in sound as a physical environment, a philosophy that blurred the boundary between artistic expression and sensory intrusion. Following Eraserhead, major studios quietly discouraged prolonged low-frequency beds, citing unpredictable psychological impact and potential liability concerns. Eraserhead's soundscape remains unique, a haunting experiment that Hollywood never replicated at the same intensity. Its industrial drone did more than shape atmosphere, it exposed how deeply audio can reach into the subconscious, a power the industry has since treated with caution. 12. Phase 4, 1974. Phase 4 is remembered today as an unconventional sci-fi thriller about hyper-intelligent ants, but beneath its experimental narrative was an equally experimental visual technique that Hollywood quietly backed away from after release. Director Saul Bass introduced a series of macro-photographic strobe effects, high-intensity light bursts, synchronized with magnified insect imagery that produced a level of sensory strain rarely seen in commercial filmmaking. The strobing wasn't uniform. Instead, it oscillated between irregular pulse frequencies, creating microflashes that disrupted the viewer's ability to settle into the scene. Because these sequences centered on extreme close-ups of biological surfaces, the juxtaposition of detail and flicker magnified the visceral impact. Early audiences reported symptoms ranging from eye strain and mild vertigo to full disorientation. Some viewers described a crawling sensation under the skin, a psychosomatic response linked to overstimulation of the visual cortex. Distributors initially dismissed the complaints as reactions to the film's unusual subject matter until theater owners began reporting clusters of walkouts during the macro lab sequences. Behind the scenes, studio advisors urged caution, warning that the irregular flicker patterns resembled those used in neurological stress experiments. There was also concern that the film's low-frequency lighting cycles might be triggering photosensitive reactions in a small percentage of viewers. Though Phase 4 was never banned, the controversy surrounding its macro strobe sequences grew large enough that similar lighting experiments quietly vanished from Hollywood productions. Bass himself intended the technique to manipulate perception, creating what he called cognitive abrasion, a deliberate attempt to make viewers feel the ants' alien intelligence pressing into their senses. But the psychological impact proved stronger than expected. After Phase 4, studios moved away from analog strobe macro combinations, citing both safety concerns and unpredictable audience responses. Today, Phase 4 is a cult classic, but it also stands as one of the last films to employ an optical method deemed too physiologically disruptive for mainstream cinema. Its visual experimentation left a warning Hollywood silently obeyed. 13. Solaris, 1972. Andrei Tarkovsky's Solaris is often praised for its meditative pacing, but behind its philosophical quietness was a visual experiment that unsettled more viewers than contemporary critics realized. Tarkovsky used a combination of extended slow shutter exposures, frame looping, and micro variations in motion cadence to create scenes that moved just slightly wrong. These distortions weren't noticeable as special effects. Instead, they subtly disrupted the viewer's vestibular sense, creating the impression that time itself was slipping or stalling. In several sequences, most notably the drive through the futuristic highway, Tarkovsky introduced asymmetrical frame repeats at irregular intervals. mimicking the perceptual glitches reported in altered state studies of the late 1960 seconds. The effect was intentionally mild, but the human brain is sensitive to inconsistencies in temporal flow. Even small disruptions can trigger nausea, derealization, or emotional detachment. Early audiences described Solaris as hypnotic, unnerving, and impossible to stay grounded in, comments that aligned closely with symptoms of disorientation. The unusual responses drew private concern from Soviet film authorities, who questioned whether the techniques were too psychologically intrusive. Meanwhile, European distributors complained that the highway sequence, in particular, caused dizziness in test screenings. Although no formal prohibition followed, studios across both continents abandoned similar experiments, worried that such temporal distortions might be interpreted as neurological manipulation rather than artistic texture. Tarkovsky defended his approach, stating that cinema should bend time to reveal the human soul. But time bending comes with cognitive consequences. Later research in visual neuroscience confirmed that irregular cadence loops can induce low-level dissociation, precisely the effect audiences reported. Solaris endures as a masterpiece of introspection, yet hidden within its tranquil aesthetic is a technique Hollywood quietly chose not to revisit. Its manipulation of temporal perception was too effective, too intimate, and too difficult to regulate. The result, a powerful visual tool effectively erased from mainstream filmmaking. 14. THX 1138-1971. George Lucas's THX 1138 is remembered for its sterile white environments and dystopian minimalism, but beneath its visual precision lay an audio experiment that Hollywood quietly shut down afterward. Lucas and sound designer Walter Murch employed a series of infrasonic tones, frequencies below 20 Hz, technically inaudible, layered beneath the film's ambient noise. These vibrations were capable of influencing the viewer's autonomic nervous system, triggering unease, anxiety, and fluctuations in heartbeat without any conscious awareness of the cause. During its early screenings, some viewers reported symptoms that mirrored confinement stress, shallow breathing, chest compression, and an overwhelming sense of pressure. Others described the film as physically exhausting, even though the imagery itself was restrained. What the audience didn't know was that many of these sensations correlated with known effects of sustained, low-frequency exposure, effects documented in acoustic research of the era, but largely ignored by the film industry. The use of infrasound wasn't illegal, but its psychological potency made studio executives uneasy. Theater owners complained that THX 1138 produced more walkouts than any release that year, not because of narrative difficulty, but because patrons felt unwell without understanding why. Internal memos from distribution partners warned that repeating such techniques could invite regulatory scrutiny or lawsuits if audiences linked their discomfort to the film's sonic design. After THX 1138, Lucas never again used infrasonic layering at the same intensity, and other directors who experimented with similar frequencies abandoned the idea quietly. Hollywood eventually established unofficial guidelines discouraging low-frequency manipulation in commercial theaters, a rare instance where the industry acted preemptively to avoid potential public backlash. Today, THX 1138 is studied for its stylistic innovation, but few know it was also a controlled psychological test hidden within a feature film. The infrasonic foundation remains intact in the audio mix, a relic of a moment when sound itself was used to shape human emotion in ways Hollywood no longer dares to attempt. 152001, A Space Odyssey, 1968. When Stanley Kubrick crafted the Stargate sequence in 2001, A Space Odyssey, he wasn't simply designing a cinematic spectacle, he was conducting one of the boldest sensory experiments ever projected in a theater. The unauthorized technique at the heart of this film was a hybrid of optical strobing, slit-scan distortions, and rapid-cycle color pulses that operated at intensities far beyond what modern safety guidelines would permit. Kubrick pushed the analog machinery of the era to extremes, creating image sequences that fluctuated at frequencies known to overload the visual cortex, disrupting the brain's ability to anchor itself to stable perceptual cues. Viewers at the 1968 premiere reported experiences ranging from disorientation to full-body tingling, while others described a sensation of leaving their own perspective, an effect neuroscientists later associated with photic overstimulation. Some audience members walked out in distress. Others sat motionless as if hypnotized. The press labeled the film a trip, but behind the scenes, several studio advisors quietly urged MGM not to let such optical rhythms appear again without testing their neurological impact. The controversy grew when medical professionals raised concerns about the sequence's intensity, noting similarities to experimental light therapy known to provoke dissociative states. Though no official ban was issued, studios began privately discouraging directors from using analog flicker patterns at similar frequencies. Insurance carriers soon followed, warning theaters about liability risks if patrons suffered seizures or panic episodes during projection. Kubrick himself remained tight-lipped about the technical parameters, but internal notes suggest he understood the effect's power and its danger. In later decades, as strobe-related guidelines became stricter, the Stargate sequence was frequently cited as an example of imagery that could never be replicated under modern standards. 2001 remains a masterpiece, but it also stands as an artifact from a time when Hollywood briefly allowed filmmakers to test the boundaries of human perception. The Stargate sequence didn't just change cinema, it quietly redefined what studios considered too risky for the audience's mind. Cinema has always shaped how we imagine the future, but these techniques crossed a line, reaching deeper into perception and physiology than Hollywood was prepared to admit. Whether through forbidden flicker patterns, subliminal imagery, or sound frequencies designed to bypass conscious awareness, each film on this list reveals a moment when innovation brushed dangerously close to psychological intrusion. Hollywood may have quietly buried these methods, but traces remain hidden in old negatives, abandoned prototypes, and stories from technicians who witnessed their effects firsthand. And as technology evolves, the question lingers: will these banned techniques stay buried, or will someone find a reason to resurrect them?